Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with cherry chocolate loaf. That's right, I am very proud of our banana bread recipe, which is why I adapted it for this amazing cherry chocolate loaf. And while cherries of course aren't anything like bananas, this really did work out extremely well. And if you're wondering why I called it cherry chocolate loaf instead of cherry chocolate bread, I'm not sure. For whatever reason, it just seemed like more of a loaf. But anyway, speaking of loafing, let's finish this intro and get started by prepping our cherries. And hopefully for this, you're going to find yourself a couple cups of fresh cherries. Although if they're still not in season, you can use frozen for this. But if you are using fresh, you will have to pit them, which is super easy if you have one of these pitters. And if you don't, just Google pitting cherries. There's all kinds of very cool tricks for that. But anyway, if you've seen one cherry pitted, you've seen them all. So let me skip ahead to when I was done. And like I said, we're going to need about 2 cups of these. And then besides the cherries, we're going to need to mix up our dry ingredients, which will include some all-purpose flour, a little bit of salt, some baking powder, and baking soda. And raise your hand if you incorrectly guessed cayenne. I knew it, but not today. And as usual, we'll go ahead and give that a quick mix with a whisk to make sure everything's evenly combined, at which point we'll set that aside and move on to our wet ingredients. And for those, we'll start by creaming a stick of butter with a little touch of sugar, using a spatula. And what we'll want to do is smear and smash that until it's very light and creamy. And this task is 1,000 times easier if your butter's nice and soft, which for a change mine was. And speaking of easier, yes, of course you can do this with an electric mixer. But doing it that way, you are not going to get your heart rate up. Unless, of course, your tie gets caught in the attachment. So I like to do this manually. And then what we'll do once our butter and sugar have been successfully creamed is go ahead and whisk in 2 eggs, but definitely one at a time. Okay, there's nothing butter hates more than having liquid emulsified into it. So if we added both eggs at once, the mixture would basically separate, and it would take a very long time for it to finally come together. But if we get one emulsified in first, then it's a lot easier to whisk in the second one. And this would also be a lot easier with an electric mixer. But an electric mixer does not build character. Oh, and a little tip, room temperature eggs will mix in easier than cold eggs, since cold eggs will make that butter stiffen up. And then what we'll do once both eggs have been incorporated, and our mixture is beautifully smooth and creamy and light, we will completely wreck that by adding some yogurt and a little bit of vanilla extract. And by wreck it, I don't mean taste-wise. Those things are going to taste good. But I mean wreck it visually. Okay, you can only emulsify a certain amount of liquid in a stick of butter, and 2 eggs is just about how much. So when you stir this in, it's going to kind of look separated and sort of granular, but do not be alarmed. Looks to the contrary, everything is fine. And you'll see once all the ingredients are added, we're going to have a gorgeous looking smooth batter. And then what we'll do once that's set is go ahead and add our cherries after we chop them, which I like to do by pulsing on and off in a food processor. But if you want, you can also do those on a cutting board with a knife. Although if you do it in the food processor, you do preserve all the juices. But either way will work, so you pick. I mean, you guys are after all the Drew Carries of how to chop your cherries. But either way, what you want is something fairly coarse. And then once those are done, we'll go ahead and add them in, along with about a half a cup of coarsely chopped chocolate. Or if you want, dark chocolate chips are fine. But I think these hand-cut chunks and shards look a little nicer in the loaf. And that's it, we'll give that a quick stir with our spatula before adding our dry ingredients. And it was right about here when I realized I'd forgotten to add my chopped walnuts, which was kind of surprising since they were like 18 inches away. But these things will happen, which is why whenever you're stirring something, always try to remember what you forgot. So I stirred those in as well. And yes, this does not look good. But don't worry, as horrible as that looks, as soon as we stir in our dry ingredients, which is what we're doing next, this is all going to come together into a beautifully smooth batter, as you will see. So we'll go ahead and add our flour mixture in and stir it in with our spatula. And as usual, we will only mix this until the flour just disappears. And then we will stop because our batter will be done. And would it wreck it if you stirred it longer than that? Well, not really unless you did it for a long time. But it's more of a question of why are you stirring something that doesn't need it. And then what we'll do once we're looking at a beautifully formed batter in our bowl is go ahead and transfer that into a lightly buttered loaf pan. And as we do that, we want to make sure we're pushing that batter down into the corners with our spatula, as well as, of course, even out the top. And that's it. We'll go ahead and give that a little shake. And then the old tappa-tappa before we transfer it into the center of a 350-degree oven for about an hour or so, or until it's nicely browned and looks like this, which definitely looks like it's done. But we got to make sure. So we'll go ahead and poke a toothpick into the center. And if it comes out clean, your loaf is done. And mine did. And then what we'll do is let this sit in the pan cooling for about 15 minutes before we very carefully remove it and place it on a rack, where we will let it cool completely before we slice it and serve it. And yes, you can actually let it cool all the way in the pan, but not if you're going to do what I'm going to do next. And that would be to apply nice thin icing to the top while this is still warm. And to make this kind of icing, all you have to do is take some powdered sugar and stir in enough milk until you achieve something with the consistency of a thin pancake batter. And then we'll go ahead and drizzle and brush that over the top. And the reason we want to do this on a rack and not in the pan is so that we get those super sexy drips going down the side. Oh yeah, it's a proven scientific fact that when it comes to icing, people love drips. And can you blame them? I mean, look at that. So we'll go ahead and glaze that as shown. And then once that's been iced, like I said, we'll let that cool all the way down. And by the time that loaf is room temp, that icing will be dry to the touch, at which point it is ready to serve up. So let me take a knife and slice in to see how we did. And you know what? It looks like we did pretty good. And I don't know about you, but for me there are very few combinations that go together better than cherry and chocolate, which is just one of the reasons I enjoyed this so much. Okay, as a child, one of my all-time favorite sweets were those cherry cordials. That whole cherry and syrup covered in crispy dark chocolate. Man, I love those things. And above and beyond the cherry and chocolate, I'm also a big fan of fruit and nuts. And those walnuts I almost forgot added just the right amount of crunch, with everything being held together in a beautifully moist, not too dense textured loaf. So I really did love everything about this. And I should have known that anything based off our banana bread recipe was bound to be amazing. And I was kind of thinking of branding this as a breakfast or brunch item, but it would definitely also work as a dessert. And just to make sure, I'm going to have it both ways. But no matter when you enjoy yours, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.